Start things off. On behalf of the Santa Clara Review and the Department of English Creative Writing Program, have the great honor to welcome Shobha Rao virtually to our campus for the Winter Writing Forward Reading Series event. I want to take a moment to acknowledge that while we may be situated on lands once inhabited by different peoples wherever we are, the Santa Clara University sits on the land of the Ohlone and the Muwekma Ohlone people. We want to remember their connection to this region and give thanks for the opportunity to live and work and learn and pray on their land, their traditional homeland. So let's just take a very brief moment of silence to pay respect to their elders and to all the Ohlone people past and present. Thank you.
Thank you.
So I thought I'd say a few words to introduce Shobha Rao and then turn it over to her. Shobha Rao moved to the United States from India at the age of 7 and is the author of the short story collection, An Unrestored Woman, and the novel, Girls Born Brighter. She won the Catherine Ann Porter Prize in Fiction, and her story, Kavita and Mustafa, was chosen by T.C. Boyle for the Best American Short Stories 2015. Girls Burn Brighter was named one of the best books of 2018 by NPR and the Washington Post and was a finalist for a Goodreads Choice Award. She lives in San Francisco and is currently the Grace Paley Teaching Fellow at the New School in New York City. An Unrestored Woman tells stories of women from the period of partition at the end of World War II when India was split into the current states of India and Pakistan. Girls Burn Brighter, set in modern-day India, traces the lives of two girls, Purnima and Savita, trapped by extreme poverty in a patriarchal, misogynist society not that different from the era of partition. Their friendship connects them through a deep love, but they're torn apart by devastating acts of cruelty when one is assaulted and the other is sold into an abusive marriage. That friendship becomes the force propelling both characters' choices and actions throughout the novel to its explosive conclusion. Shobha Rao's work addresses issues of discrimination and the struggle for equality related to immigration, women's rights, and economic and social justice. She portrays these themes in her stories and novel through vividly created female protagonists, often from the poorest reaches of Indian culture. Her characters' successes and failures reveal the myriad ways that family, culture, and social, political, and economic forces play themselves out upon people differently depending on their circumstances and resources. Time and again, she shows how acts of love and recognition make the difference between a character finding the strength and vision to persevere or being destroyed by forces beyond their control. I welcome Shobha Rao and turn it over to her now. Thank you.
Thank you, Kirk. So thank you all for being here. It's such a pleasure and an honor to be here with you. And it's such a great, I was telling Kirk earlier, such a great break from the monotony and the challenges we're facing right now to be among writers, to talk of writing. So I'm so appreciative of this opportunity. So my reading, I've selected from Girls Burn Brighter, which is my novel. And just to set it up for you and talk to you a little bit about the themes before I start to read. So Girls Burn Brighter takes place in Indravalli. It's a fictional town, village actually, that is very much representative of the little village that my grandparents are from. And I lifted many of the details regarding that village from my own ancestral home in southern India. And so it follows two young women, two girls, as Kirk said, Purnima and Savita. And Purnima, they're both from the weaving caste, so they're both weavers in the small village. And Purnima enters a very difficult, challenging, and violent marriage. And she is then separated from her very good friend, best friend, Savita, who escapes a kind of a horrific incident that happens to her, and ends up becoming a prostitute in order to live, and then is eventually trafficked into the United States. And the novel alternates sections between their two journeys as Purnima leaves her horrible marriage and decides she is going to find Savita, and she is going to be relentless in her search for her. And so the novel alternates between their two stories. And so in the writing of the novel, a couple of things that I wanted to focus on stemmed from a case, an actual case in Berkeley, California, involving a landlord, a South Indian landlord by the name of Lucky Reddy Balreddy. And he was such a successful landlord and restaurateur that he owned, he was only second to the University of California, Berkeley, in the number of apartments that he owned and rented out. So you can imagine how many he owned and how wealthy he was. Well, in 1999, a case broke in which one of the girls, who's 13 years old, she died of carbon monoxide poisoning. And that incident revealed the fact that, or the alleged contention that the landlord, Bali Reddy, had trafficked in 99 girls and women into the United States and into sexual and domestic slavery. Okay, so let's just go back to the fact that this took place in Berkeley, California, right? When I learned of it, it chilled me to the bone, because here it is, right here under our noses, and arguably one of the most progressive places in this country. And to learn that it was here that it was happening to my brother, my sisters, right? To all of our sisters, was deeply chilling. And subsequently, I ended up working, as I alluded to earlier, at a domestic violence organization in San Jose. And while I was working there, I actually came to work with one of the victim survivors, I should say, of that trafficking episode incident. And so, not to get into the details of her story, but what was the most salient things about her, what deeply moved me, is that she had in no way lost her belief in humanity, in the goodness in people. She was incredibly courageous, resilient, and generous. And I was stunned by how the sort of light in her remained, even after, sort of living through horrific circumstances. It's getting really dark. I'm gonna turn on the light. So everybody hold on. And then I'm gonna stand in front of it. Okay. And so in writing Girls Burn Brighter, I really wanted to celebrate that aspect, right? Her resilience, her incredible courage in the face of unrelenting forces, and her perseverance, right? And her generosity. And so that is how I approached the novel. And a couple of themes that I wanted to explore in the novel. One was the worth of a woman or a girl, right? So what is, literally, this is a question I began the book with. What is the body of a girl worth, right? What is, and not just the body, but what is the life of a girl worth? What are her dreams worth? What is her virginity worth? What are her ambitions worth in society, in not just Indian society, every society? And that was one of the main explorations of the novel. One of the other things I wanted to sort of study and explore was hunger. And hunger, not just as a physical state, so not just the hunger for food, sustenance, but so not just physical hunger, but spiritual hunger, sexual hunger, the hunger for love, for friendship, for a place in society, in the tapestry of what and who we are. And so hunger is another one of the themes of the book. So having said that, I would like to read from the very opening of the book. And then I wanted to read an excerpt from sort of the middle of the book. And when I get there, I'll go ahead and set that up. So I'm going to grab it and begin at the beginning of the book. And like I said, the village that this novel, the beginning of the novel certainly takes place in, is called Indravalli. The most striking thing about the temple near the village of Indravalli was not readily apparent. No, one had to first climb the mountain and come close. One had to take a long, thoughtful look at the entrance, at the door, not at its carved panels or its fine graining, but at how the door stood so brave and so luminous and so alone. How it seemed to stand strong and tall, as if still a tree. It was the wood, lumbered from a grove of trees northwest of Indravalli. The grove was cultivated by an old woman, they said more than 100 years old, who was childless. She and her husband had been farmers, and when she'd come to understand that she'd never have children, she'd started planting trees as a way to care for something, as a way to nurture something fragile and lovely. Her husband had surrounded the young saplings with thorny bushes to keep out wild animals. And it being a dry region, she'd had to carry water from many kilometers away to water them. Their grove now boasted hundreds of trees, all of them steady and swaying in the dry wind. A journalist from a local newspaper once went to interview the old woman. He arrived at tea time, and he and the old woman sat in the shade of one of the trees, its wide leaves rustling high above them. They sipped their tea soundlessly. Even the journalist, forgetting all of his questions, was overcome by the quiet, green beauty of the place. He had heard of her childlessness and her recently dead husband. And so, to be delicate, he said, "They must keep you company, the trees." The old woman's gray eyes smiled and she said, "Oh, yes, I'm never lonely. I have hundreds of children." The journalist saw an opportunity. "So you see them as children?" "Don't you?" she said. There was silence. The journalist took a long, deep look into the grove of trees, their thick trunks, their strength, despite drought and disease and insects and floods and famine, and yet shining with gold green light, radiant even in the heat and heaviness of afternoon. "You're a fortunate woman," he said, "to have so many sons." The old woman looked at him, her eyes on fire, her wrinkled face taking on the glow of her girlhood. "I am fortunate," she said, "but you're mistaken, young man. These aren't my sons, not one. These, she said, are my daughters. So that is the opening of the novel. And I will then like sort of go midway into the novel. And at this point, Savita, this is the young woman who has gotten embroiled in this trafficking ring, and she's eventually, or a prostitution ring, I should say, and then she's eventually trafficked into the United States to Seattle, actually. And because it shares a border with Canada, it's a huge transit point for a lot of trafficking, human trafficking. So this is while she's still in India, and she has basically, and this is again harkening back to my examining the worth of a woman, right? And I literally wanted to do that. So I had Sabita forced to make a choice to actually have her hand amputated in order to save the lives of her sisters, and to, give them opportunities in life that she does not have. It's actually quite a gruesome decision. I know that. But I wanted to very much examine what is the body of a woman worth. So I did make that choice. And so in this section, her hand has just been amputated, and she's waiting to be sent to Saudi Arabia because she's been bought basically by a man there. So she's waiting for to be sent there. And one of the reasons I like this section, to read the section, is, for one thing, it's sort of, unto itself. So you don't need to know much more about the novel to understand this section. But one of the other reasons I like this section is because it's one of the few times that Savita is treated as human, as fully human, and as treated as an equal to a man. So I hope you enjoy it. Savita waited for her ticket to Saudi to arrive. She was no longer considered one of the regular prostitutes, but one of the special ones. What did that mean? Savita wasn't quite sure. She didn't have to take as many customers, that was one thing, because mostly, as it turned out, the fetish for an amputee wasn't all that common. Most of the men preferred one of the girls with both hands intact. Though the customers she did have paid more and were much more talkative than they had been, as if her missing hand were an expensive conversation piece, as if it lent her an added ability to understand their deepest selves, their darkest fears. Savita was happy to listen. In fact, she became such a good listener that she could sense a man's sorrow, the source of it, the minute he entered the room. It was easy. A man with a nagging wife held his head unnaturally high when he entered. A man who'd been unloved as a child waited for her to speak first. A man who had no money, who was perhaps spending the last of it on her, held on to the doorknob for longer than he should. She once had a customer who confessed to having been in jail for killing my brother, he said, though he said nothing more about it. But he went on to tell her that after his third year in jail, he'd escaped and lived as a fugitive for more than 20 years. In Meghalaya, he said, in the forests. He said he'd been the pampered eldest son of a wealthy family, wheat merchants. I had no idea how to cook even rice, he said, let alone live in the wilderness. But he learned to make his way in the forests, he told her, and he began to realize certain things. What things? Savita asked. But at that point in the story, he stopped. Savita waited. She watched him. He didn't look like a fugitive, though she had no idea what one might look like. She'd expect him to at least be wild looking, haunted in some way. But this man looked quite serene, contented even, as if he'd just had a nice, refreshing bath and a good breakfast. At last, after almost 10 minutes of sitting in silence, the man said, "By my 5th year in the forest, I realized I could no longer feel. Not just that I couldn't feel pain or loneliness or lust, not just those things, but that I could no longer even feel my own heart. Do you understand? It was beating, but it might as well have been a stone beating against another stone." By his 11th or 12th year in the forest, he said, I was no longer human. He said, I'd catch an animal in a trap or with a crude bow and arrow and kill it without a thought, strangle it, snap its neck while I looked into its eyes and not feel the slightest thing, not even victory. I would bash its head in with my bare hand, and it felt like I was cracking a nut. As he neared the 20th year, he said, he could recall no other life than that of a fugitive. He had memories, he told her, of the time before he was a fugitive, vague memories of being in jail, even vaguer of being a son, a brother. It was as if, he said, it was as if that was what I was born to be, a fugitive. And not just that, but that was what I was born, a fugitive. Do you understand? This time, Savita did, a little. Every so often, I met other fugitives, sometimes tribals, but they generally left me alone, he told her. They asked no questions. Questions are for the living, and they could very clearly see that I was dead. At the start of my 24th year, he said, I began talking to the universe. Not just talking to it, but commanding it. I could make clouds part. I could make fish swim to me, swim into my hand with nothing in that hand besides desire. I could make wind stop blowing. I remember one night, he said, deep in the forest, I was asleep and was awoken by a strange rustling. When I sat up and looked around me, there was a cobra staring straight back. I'd fashioned a kind of hatchet, so I reached for it, but the cobra was faster. It caught my hand just as I touched the hatchet, and it said, you can't kill me twice, which is when I knew it was my brother. And then the cobra said, find out something for me. I waited. I thought it would ask me to find out whether our parents were all right, or whether fate and chance were in battle or in collusion, or whether our cycle of suffering would ever truly end. But instead, the cobra said, find out for me the depth of the forest floor. The depth, I said? Yes, I've tried, you see. I've tried to snake my way all the way down. That's what we do after all, we snakes. But I can't seem to find its floor. It's as if I could keep going and going and going. That maybe there is no end. But there has to be. Maybe it goes to the core of the earth, or maybe somewhere even darker or hotter. Don't you think? No, I don't, I said. Neither do I, the cobra said, and slithered away into the forest. Here, the man, who was clearly no longer a fugitive, as he was sitting in Savita's room, looked at her, maybe for the first time, and said, that is when I walked out of the forest, the very next morning. Because you see, the cobra didn't want an answer. It didn't want anything. certainly not to know the depth of the forest floor. What it wanted was to reveal to me that there is no end to guilt, no end to the prices we pay, that we are the forest and our conscience, our hell, is the forest floor. He looked at her. She thought he might be waiting for her to say something, but no, he was just looking at her. I went to the nearest ranger station that morning, that very morning, walked right through the doors and told them who I was and what I'd done. At first, they didn't believe me. Some guy who was saying he'd lived in the forest for 25 years? Why would they? They didn't even think it was possible. But after some discussion among them, they drove me to the police station in Shillong, and there they had to call it in. So they called the police station in Guntur, but they said that the old courthouse where all the criminal case files would have been kept had burned down long ago. And the back room, which would have had their own files from that time, kept in a musty room, had been chewed through by rats. So really, there was no record of me at all, anywhere. The constable put down the receiver, looked at me, and explained everything the Guntur police had told him, almost apologetically. And then he said I was free to go. What did you do? Savita asked. I came home, he said, but by then both my parents had died. From heartache, some said, but that's what people want to believe. It's more romantic that way. If I had to guess, I'd say my father died from rage and my mother from boredom. They were childless at the end of their lives, it's true, even after having had 2 sons. I wish I could apologize to them for that. I wish for many things, but they must have searched too for the forest floor. And with that, the former fugitive, who's now a customer, and yet had not once touched Savita, his face as placid as the surface of a still lake, said, so, how did you lose your hand? So, thank you. I'll stop there. And I would love to take questions and have a conversation if it's okay with you. So yeah, I'm happy.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Yes, it'd be wonderful to continue a brilliant conversation we were having earlier this afternoon. If you have questions, you could either put them in the chat, or I suppose we could, if you use like the little reaction hand signal or something, we can try to see people to see who has questions. But that could be challenging with 2 pages. I just noticed, hearing that story again after, like I told you, I finished the novel last week and have been thinking about it a lot, and I kind of forgot about that wonderful enigmatic story. It really does stand alone quite well as a piece of fiction.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I like to read it again. Like I said, it's one of the few times Savita is treated as an equal, and for that alone, it stands out for me. And I think it, for me, just it's kind of a pause. I think when we write, especially something that is really intense and kind of goes to very troubling places, it's nice to give the reader a kind of a pause and sort of an oasis in which to rest and to hear a story, and I love stories within stories, as when I'm reading a novel, certainly, and I think they're a really great way to convey not just human truths, but also, like I said, to give the reader a break and to give their sort of imagination, set them on a different different course for a little bit, and then come back to a story that was that is maybe demanding in certain ways. So yeah, I do love stories within stories. And somebody who comes to mind who does it really, really well is Roberto Bolaño in his work. And 2666 comes to mind as a really kind of instructive, sublime work where there's so many stories within stories. So yeah, I try to aspire to that kind of oasis building for the reader.
Yeah, yes, hearing it again reminded me of how you do this several times toward the end of the novel too, with when Savita's on the road and the two different men tell their stories to her in English and she can't even understand.
Yeah.
And it's making me realize how these men are using her for their confessions. You know, they're like she's the confessional. And it's just another way that this question you're asking about, you know, what is a woman's body worth, and earlier you were talking about the boundaries of a woman's body, and it feels like these are just another way that men are sort of imposing their worlds on a woman.
Yeah, and in fact, I think yes, indeed, because to them it doesn't actually matter that she doesn't understand what they're saying. In fact, that might be why they're actually being so confessional, because they know she can't understand. But also, and I love that you brought up the boundaries, because we were earlier in our earlier seminar conversation talking about how a woman's body is this sort of the final boundary that she has, and maybe the only boundary that she has control over, because, you know, sort of like nations and armies won't protect, very rarely protect the bodies of women. And so, and what I also was trying to convey is what I feel is the sort of the universal power of storytelling. We almost don't even have to understand the story. You know, I've been in foreign countries, in other countries, listening to, you know, to conversations in a restaurant, or, you know, eavesdropping in a bar, and I don't need to know the story or to understand it to know that it's a joyous one or it's a tragic one, or, you know, and I love that about encountering storytelling. It's such a primal act, such a necessary one, and it almost transcends language as far as I'm concerned. And so inserting of stories within stories not just challenges the reader's notions of, you know, what is the relationship between this man and this very young a woman whose history he cannot possibly know, and whose language he absolutely doesn't know. So what is, you know, how does she navigate that boundary of language and body? But then also to explore what an incredible tool of human connection and sort of human emotional sharing of human emotion that storytelling can be. It's absolutely vital to our thriving and to our lives and to understanding our lives. Yeah, so that's, I think, of why I arrived at fiction in the first place, is because it explained life to me in a way that life couldn't, the lived one. So
we're starting to get some questions in the chat, so I'll work down those. I just wanted to say that notion of the tonality of telling one story, and it is really came through in hearing, imagining her not understanding these men driving down the road, and her response to it really came through in the reading. That was nice.
Okay. Yeah.
Marilyn Edelstein, who's one of our faculty, is asking, was Toni Morrison's character Ava Peace in Sula, who loses her leg or lets it be cut off to save her family, in the back of your mind when you had your character cut off her hand?
Oh my gosh, Marilyn, it's extraordinary that you made that connection, because I did not. I've read Sula, and, you know, here's the thing, here's the power of storytelling and novels, is that we read them and they forever live inside of us. And as a writer, I am indebted, deeply indebted to everything I've ever read. But I mean, Toni Morrison, I mean, I don't even have the words to express how a large a part of my reading life and obviously inspiration and consciousness she is and her work is. So I hadn't thought of that, but as soon as you mentioned it, of course, like of course I'm deeply sort of I'm borrowing for that from that, you know, and I hadn't thought of it. So thank you so much for pointing it out. Of course, yes. And you know, the thing is, the what Toni Morrison does with the poetry of her language, and it's, you know, utter seduction is something that I, you know, can only aspire to, but I think of it all the time. And as I'm writing, in fact, I only read poetry. And so if I, at the start of my writing day, over the course of my writing day, I'll read poetry because its language is so precise, that it's imagistic, and I you know, derive a great deal of like propulsion from that. It seems to be the engine of language, right? And so and of course Toni Morrison's work, I don't read it while I'm writing, but deeply influenced by it, of course. And so thank you for pointing that out. Now I'll mention it from now on. I'm like, yeah, the hand comes from the leg. Thank you.
And what a wonderfully poetic writer she is too. So
Yes, absolutely.
the next two questions kind of connect, so I'll read them both. Claire Andreski asked, how did the Berkeley case influence how you wrote about Savita's experience? And then Michelle Burnham, who is also faculty, she asked, first she said, thank you for that wonderful reading. I can't wait to read your novel. Can you say something about how you moved from the court case to the novel? What does that process look like for you as a writer of fiction? And do you feel like your novel answers the question about the value of a woman, or do you want readers to ask themselves that question?
Yeah, thank you. So I'll answer the last part of it first. As a writer and as a novelist, I think the greatest power is in asking the question and letting the reader answer it for themselves. So I don't, you know, I didn't answer the question. I hope I didn't, you know, at any moment say, here's what a girl is worth. Here's what the, you know, life and the body of a woman is worth. But I wanted to ask that question and then allow the reader the space and the sort of lifelong like exploration of it. I wanted to leave that to the reader. And as for the case in Berkeley, obviously that was sort of like the kernel, you know, the beginning of how I started to think about this novel. But I very much moved away from the facts, the known facts of that case, because I didn't want it to be, you know, a sort of a creative nonfiction piece about, you know, one or two of the women involved in that trafficking case. I want it's a work of pure fiction, right? But and in fact, that case, obviously, as I said, took place in Berkeley, and I moved this whole thing to Seattle, and you know, there's a whole South Dakota angle, and so I'll leave it at that. But I absolutely was, like I said, chilled and really deeply sobered by that case, because it actually broke open very soon after I moved to the Bay Area. And you know, here I was thinking, oh, I'm gonna, you know, go to this incredible progressive, you know, which, you know, all of those things. And yet right under our noses, this was happening. And I thought, I've walked the streets of Berkeley. You know, I've eaten in restaurants, and, you know, I've eaten at his restaurant. And I thought, I was in the midst of such horror, the buying and the selling of the bodies of girls. And I thought, and here I am completely oblivious. And you know, I felt such rage around that, outrage, and then just inner rage. And I think that is what I used as my greatest inspiration, not the case or the facts of the case itself, but that rage I felt and the absolute impulse to write that rage out. And then, of course, once I started working with the woman who was, you know, a survivor of that horrific case, I thought, okay, it's not just rage, right? What I need to do is celebrate the goodness of you know the goodness that is sort of enduring in us, that we can protect no matter what we are put through in life. We have almost an obligation to protect the sort of fire within us. I am saying this from a very privileged place. Believe me, I know this. But on the other hand, I have encountered incredible stories of overcoming, and that is what I choose to believe in, and to celebrate in my work, and certainly in Girls Burn Brighter. So yes, that case was an incredible inspiration, and I used it, but none of the facts of it.
I think, we talked earlier about the end of the novel without giving it away, and
Yeah.
I won't, but just to say that I think the way you choose to end the novel is another way that you leave that question to the reader about what is the worth of a body of a girl. That
Yeah.
you're leaving the reader to have to wrestle with that question.
Yeah, I'm so glad. In addition to what we talked about the ending in our previous conversation, I mean, so much is about this was about these in Girls Burn Brighter was the young women trying to trying to find to seize license and autonomy in over their own bodies and over their own thoughts and over their own destinies, and the ending very much was a nod to the fact that let's finally ultimately give these girls the choice, on what is going to be on the other side of that door, right? And so I very much focused in on giving them that autonomy they've been seeking throughout, and choice that they've been seeking throughout the novel.
So we have another question from Sophie Wood. She says, your writing is so lovely. I was wondering what importance it was to you to have two main characters with such obvious scars that others can see.
Um, this again goes back to the body, right? And I think that with Purnima, for instance, I had a moment where her face becomes incredibly scarred, and I wanted her. She had been like kind of a very timid character, and she very much depended on Savita to, just sort of guide her and help her navigate through life. And once Savita is gone and she's sort of scarred, it was a way for me to allow Purnima to say, I am done. I am done with the conventional measures of my life, the conventional forces of my life. Now that I am scarred, I can leave my destiny. I can leave this marriage, and I can leave whatever life, whatever is expected of me as an obedient wife and daughter, right? And that scarring was emblematic of a deeper sort of a scar that just gave her the courage and the passionate need to escape. And I think, when we talk again, going back to the worth of a woman, once she's scarred, once she's in some way disfigured, then her valuation drops immensely. And that, I mean, we can, argue the of course, how does it drop and why does it drop and all those questions. But in the course of this novel and this story, it is not up for argument that she has now lost all viability as a daughter and wife. And so that gives her the power to leave. That gives her the courage to leave. And I think that even though her worth is decreased in society's estimation, in her own estimation, her worth is infinitely increased. And I wanted to explore that dichotomy, and how what is considered maybe unacceptable or uh, 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 an awful sort of bad thing, we can turn into something that is something that gives us more license, more autonomy and power in the world. So it is about turning that, turning the tables on that. So the scarring was very much about that in both their cases.
Yeah, I remember reading and seeing Purnima being just so happy to see how she took on the power of how she looked in terms of how she could use that in social situations, and how she refused to let others gaze control her, but instead
Yeah.
she controlled the situation. It was very well done in the novel.
Thank you. And because she's no longer a sexual commodity in the world, right? And so she's liberated from that, and
Mhm.
that empowers her in incredible ways. So thank you. I'm so glad that came through.
I think you partly answered this next question, but there's more
Mhm.
to it. And my apologies if I mispronounced the name. Mukta Sharangpani is
Mhm.
asking, so excited, or saying, so excited to read the book, Shobha. Loved the reading and the parts you chose to share. Wondering in what ways you might have pulled in caste identity and the ways it scarred Purnima and Savita's gendered and classed experiences.
Mm-hmm. So I made them both from the cast of Weavers, which is actually the cast I was born into, and I saw, and it's kind of a lower middle cast. It's not one of the higher casts or anything, and I saw in my ancestral village, that most everybody was from the cast of Weavers. And it was such a beautiful thing to see, cloth being made. And yet in the larger society, within this caste structure, we were not in any way respected or honored, like maybe the highest caste were, like Brahmins and so forth. And I thought, but we're making this cloth. I mean, how beautiful is this act, and this this creation, this act of creation. And so I wanted to give Savita and Purnima that very profession, and have them be born into that same caste, because I actually think of it, I have seen it transform in my life to kind of a minor detail of my life, to something that really truly defines me. I don't feel cotton in the same way against my skin. And so to me, it's become an incredibly beautiful part of who I am. And I wanted to not only give that to my characters, but I wanted to make sure they were in no way shackled by the fact that it's one of the lower castes. In fact, Savita carries a piece of sari, cotton sari, with her, across continents and into her, into the very ends of the novel. And it is her greatest solace. And how can cloth be that? Anything can be that, right? If it is something that she made that cloth, and she carries a piece of it, and that is her one of the most transformative and greatest sources of identity and power that she has in the novel. And I absolutely celebrate that with her in my own life.
We have another question. Maybe this will be our last one. Sharmila Lodia, again, if I said it wrong, I apologize. Shobha, I loved hearing you read from your wonderful book. Can you say a bit more about the recuperative role of friendship in shaping women's sense of agency and worth?
Well, it's incredible. As I thank you for the question. As I alluded to in the seminar portion, um, a female friendship has been something that I didn't think much about. Just sort of had female friends, took them for sort of granted. And it was not until I started working in the field of domestic violence, which I no longer do, but it was in that work that I learned, that I witnessed how it can lend real sort of strength and resilience in the lives of women, in not just the journey of their lives, but in sort of illuminating them, making us less lonely in the course of this journey. And that is something that I've very recently found an appreciation for, just in the making of my own sort of female friends. And it's been such an incredible thing to witness that sort of unfolding in my own life. And as I was sort of writing about it at the same time. And so, yes, I find friendship to be resilience making. I find friendship that to be like almost a safe house, a harbor for our sort of greatest challenges. It's not that a friend is going to come, sort of as Purnima does, come looking for us as we're trafficked. I mean, hopefully none of us have that as our reality ever. But what friendship does is give us a place of quiet and a place where nothing is asked of us beyond just that silence and maybe the quietude of the not asking, the not demanding, the not having to meet a certain gaze. And I think I've found that female friendship, not just in the lives that I've witnessed, but in my own life, has been deeply, deeply not just satisfying, but it's fed this very deep sort of loneliness. And I found that over and over again, and certainly in my recent life. And again, in my work, I've set out to explore that very ache that is quieted by friendship, by true friendship. So I hope that answers your question.
Thank you. I think there are a few other people thanking you for this wonderful reading and
My pleasure. Thank
reading your
you.
novel. I'm going to ask one last question, which
Sure.
is, you have just, as you said, just come up for air from finishing a draft of the next novel. And are you willing to share anything about what this novel's about?
Yeah, of course, trepidatiously. But so one of the things that I'm trying to do with this novel, so both my short story collection and Unrestored Woman and my novel Girls Burn Brighter very much take place in India, and Girls Burn Brighter obviously moves sort of halfway through to the US. But what I wanted to do in this new novel I'm working on is to have almost all of it set in the United States. I mean, I lived here for most of my life, and I really have had trouble writing about America. And I've always wondered why that is. And I hope it's not because I'm romanticizing my childhood in any way, or that certainly I'm nostalgic for it, but I don't want to be locked into always writing about India, because certainly contemporary India I know nothing about. So I wanted to move away from that and to really explore American life and life in America. And although it does, the three main characters are Indian Americans, they're immigrants. I also didn't want to really explore the immigrant experience, because I think that's been done really well.
Mm.
And I'm not saying it's been conclusively done, but I thought I want a different exploration of these three lives as mother and father and daughter, and living in southeast Montana, actually. So a region that I've driven through and found really evocative. So I set my novel there, and it's these three lives. So I'm it's been a really interesting struggle to write about America, and I'm not sure why. But as novelists, I think the imperative is to walk into territory that is difficult, to really sort of go to those places that seem impassable, And so I really wanted to center this novel in America. So I have no title for it. I'm just at the first draft, so I have a long road ahead of me. But I hope that it comes together, because I think that something of my life will connect, my life in India and my sort of very deep Indian roots, and my deep identity as an Indian, and of course how America has shaped me and my identity as an American. I really would like to marry those two with this novel. So wish me luck. Yeah, we're at the early stages here. So
Well, we do wish you luck on your long American road.
thank you. I'm so appreciative. Thank you for this opportunity. The Writing Forward series is amazing, and I'm honored to have shared this time with you. So thank you.
Thank you so much.
Of course. So
Just want to, so yeah, thank you for that. And just, you can buy her books at your favorite independent bookstore. We can't sell them to you right now like we usually do. And also we'll be selling, we'll have a way to buy her books and a lot of other of our representatives for the Santa Clara Review at the AWP Book Fair. If you want to stop by and see us, we'll virtually, because that's the way it is this year. And you can also go to our website to get a copy of the review and find out how to get Shobha's books if you can't on your own. Okay, lots of thank yous in the chat. And
oh, wonderful. Thank you. And I'm so delighted we spent this time together. It's a conversation about writing anything with writers. I'm just absolutely over the moon. So thank you. I appreciate it.
all right, have a good evening. All
You
right.
too. Bye,
Thank
guys.
you everyone for coming. Bye-bye.
Of course. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Emma, thank you. Take care.